JNUC 2023. I'm Adam Derrick from Jamf. Got my friend Sean Rabbit from Jamf. Awesome. We also got our pals from Microsoft. We got Michael Epping and Mark Morzinski. Sorry. They're going to be talking to you this morning about Jamf and Microsoft Entra ID Conditional Access. Before we start the presentation, did want to note one thing. We're going to be doing Q&A a little bit different this year. You are going to be using the session Q&A within the JNUC app. If you run into any issues submitting questions, just feel free to go ahead and force quit the app and relaunch it. I'll pass it over to Sean.
We'll pass it over to...
I'll get started. So.
Here you go.
Good.
Who will pass it?
Yeah. All right. Hey, everybody. So welcome to our session, Jamf and Microsoft Entra ID Conditional Access. I am Mark Morzinski, and my clicker's not going forward. I'm Mark Morzinski. I am a product manager in our security customer experience team. I work with customers on their deployments, and I take the learning and feedback from those deployments and work it back into the product to make things easier and better for everybody else. And to be inclusive of some members here that might have a visual impairment, I'm going to quickly describe what I look like. I'm a late 30s white man with short brown hair, wearing jeans and a purple t-shirt with the Mac Admins Foundation logo on it. Michael.
My name is Michael Epping. I'm on the same team as Mark. I am also a white man in his 30s, wearing dark pants and a green Mac Admins shirt.
And I'm Sean Rabbit, Senior Consulting Engineer for Identity and Access Management here at Jamf. If you can't see me, be thankful, but I am wearing a slightly more fabulous Mac Admin shirt.
Yes, thanks. All right, so from an agenda here, and again, like okay. So this is supposed to be an extension of the talk that we did previously, so if you missed that, don't worry, we'll get you caught up. And then we're gonna go a little bit deeper in terms of conditional access. Then we're gonna talk about some of the common deployments and issues we see customers run into from a Microsoft Entra ID conditional access perspective. Sean's gonna talk about how you can overcome some of those challenges using Jamf Pro. Michael's gonna do the same thing when it comes to Jamf Connect. And then we're gonna wrap this up with some go-dos. We want this session to be very actionable like our talk was last year. So just a quick show of hands, how many people in here either have a conditional access administrator role or a global administrator type of role? They can go back and make changes. So maybe what, like 40%, 50%? Okay, cool. Right, we want people to go back on Monday and start making some improvements to their environment. So, okay. I know someone here is thinking, what in the world is Microsoft Entra ID? This is the service formerly known as Azure Active Directory. The only thing that's changed here is the name. That's better to align with the Microsoft Entra product family, so things like Entra Permissions Management, which is our cloud infrastructure entitlement management tool. So if you hear one of us, there's a good chance that one of us or all three of us are gonna slip up and say Azure Active Directory. Just know we're talking about the same thing. Now the thing here to know is that Microsoft Entra ID is a full-blown identity access as a service solution. This makes it different from things like ADFS, which is just a secure token service. It just issues out those tokens. It's an STS. Microsoft Entra ID does that as well. But it also does more than that. It also do provisioning and deprovisioning of users to these SaaS applications using the SCIM protocol. It also has governance, so we can make sure the right users have access to the right resources at the right time. We also can do passwordless-based credentials, and this is things like the Authenticator app, Windows Hello for Business, and FIDO2, and we actually talked more about that in our talk last year. And then we also can talk about conditional access, which is what we're here to really talk about today. So conditional access is our zero trust engine. As an administrator, you can determine if a certain condition occurs, what different controls need to be in place in order to get access to that resource. It's all in the name there, conditional access. Now, conditional access understands lots about that user's activity. It understands where that user is coming from. It understands if there's any risk on that sign-in event or there's any risk on that user object. We can also do things like application requirements and say that you have to come from using something like Outlook Mobile. That way the user cannot accidentally save an attachment to their personal OneDrive or personal Dropbox. They have to save it to the corporate OneDrive or the corporate Dropbox. Also determines device identity. This is becoming more and more important as customers adopt that zero trust mindset. The user identity is very, very important, but we cannot ignore that device identity either. Now, conditional access applies to something called cloud applications, and I'll talk about what that means here on the next slide, but our goal really needs to be here is that we want a conditional access policy and scope of every single request. This is a core principle of zero trust. This is that verify explicitly. So if we have any users or applications that have been excluded from conditional access policies, we need to go back and take a look at that and understand and make sure we have a conditional access policy in scope of the request. Now, I said conditional access applies to cloud applications. What do I mean by that? A cloud application is going to be something like a web API, a web app, or even like a website using the SAML protocol or an OpenID connector OAuth 2 confidential client. Not to get too into the identity protocol weeds, but a confidential client is an application that has the ability to securely protect a secret and then use that to authenticate to an identity provider, in this case, Microsoft Entra ID. Cloud apps are not things like the desktop and client applications. This is going to be things like the OpenID connector OAuth 2 native clients. These have no way to securely protect a secret. So things that are going to fall into this bucket are going to be things like Outlook, Word, Jamf Connect, and Michael's going to talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. Now, instead of trying to teach everybody all these in-depth parts of the identity protocols, a good way to keep this in the back of your head is that conditional access policies apply to the resource, okay? And this makes sense if you think about it a little bit, because we're not trying to protect access to Outlook. We are trying to protect access to the data that Outlook is trying to access, right? So when you have a conditional access policy that applies to Exchange Online and says you have to perform MFA, your Teams users get prompted to do an MFA prompt because the Teams client is doing a graph call to get the Exchange calendar, and they have to be able to meet that challenge response. So just remember that conditional access has to apply to the resource. Now, another thing that we see come up pretty common is how is conditional access policies being evaluated? All conditional access policies are going to be ANDed together. Then we check to see, is there a policy in scope of this request? If there is, we apply the controls in the following order. First, we look for any block controls. Those have to be satisfied first. If there are no block controls, we then move on to the grant controls, and they are applied in this order. Now, the thing to keep in mind about conditional access is that we'll try to satisfy the request without having the user to do any interaction. So if you have a conditional access policy that says you have to come from a compliant device or perform MFA, if they're coming from a compliant device, they will not get prompted for MFA at all. But here you can see that Michael signed into with a client here that was not compliant because the is compliant flag there was set to false. So in that case, he would then have gotten prompted for MFA. So let's walk through a couple different policies here. Our first policy is, it says, if Jane Smith is accessing the resource of Exchange Online, she has to perform MFA. And then my second policy says, in order for Jane Smith to access the resource of Exchange Online, she has to come from a compliant device. Who here thinks that Jane is going to have to perform MFA? Okay. Who here thinks she's going to have to come from a compliant device? Okay. Who here thinks she's going to have to come from a compliant device and perform MFA? For those that did not vote, what do you think is going to happen? Is like she just like quiet quit or something? Like I don't know. Okay, you're right. So it's going to be both, right? She's going to have to do MFA and come from that compliant device because you have to meet and satisfy all of those grant controls. Okay. So we made this flow chart here. This is mostly for your reference for next week when you go back and start taking a look at your conditional access policies to kind of help you understand if policies are being applied or not. If you don't have a good handle on your conditional access policies, a good place to start is the Conditional Access Insight and Reporting Blade in the Azure portal. This shows you the impact of your conditional access policies over time. It shows you things like what type of devices are, what applications they're using, things like that. It's a little tough to see, but at that top middle section, there's the number 63 next to the color of orange, and it says the words not applied. This is showing you that you have 63 sign-ins taking place where there are no conditional access policies being applied. We want to go ahead and take a look at that as soon as we can. Now, if you want to dig a little bit deeper, we have something called the Conditional Access Gap Analyzer Workbook. This is a pre-built workbook that is on everybody's tenant, just like any of the other workbooks that we have. Has a preset bunch of templates and tiles there for you. So a good one to start with is the high-risk sign-in with no conditional access policies being applied. That means there's users that have high risk and there's no conditional access policies being applied. Start with that. The good thing about these workbooks, and any of the workbooks we have, is they're written in the Kusto query language. So you can take those things, you can modify them, you can copy them, you can make your own dashboards. If you don't know KQL, that's okay. Talk to someone on your Azure side. They probably have a good handle on it, but I have it on good authority. There's a KQL book coming out next year. Now let's talk about some of the common deployments and issues that we see with customers here. Okay, so some of the common conditional access policies we see, at a minimum doing MFA, but even moving to more of those stronger credentials, those phish-resistant credentials, things like Hello for Business, FIDO2, or cert-based authentication. Blocking things where we have legacy authentication or blocking places where we have no business or anything like that, no users in that country, just straight up blocking. Another thing we start to see more is more of the device-based types of policies. So requiring that you come from a compliant device, or if you're on a Windows device, requiring hybrid Azure AD join. And this is really important because we also start to see more restrictive policies. So if you have a conditional access policy that says, oh, we don't know what the device you're coming from, we want you to re-authenticate more often, it's very, very important we make sure all of our Apple devices, our corporate Apple devices, are showing up as managed devices in Microsoft Entra ID, or we might be over-prompting those users for no real reason. Then the other type of thing we see is policies applying to all applications, and I'll talk about what I mean here in a second about that. So some of the issues we see here, First one is that like not really understanding their conditional access policies and how they're being applied. Hopefully those previous slides really kind of clean that up. Some other ones here, let me just kind of open this up while it's working. So getting overly prompted, device check failures or compliance check failures, device registration failures, things like that. Sean's actually going to talk about how we can overcome some of those challenges here in the next section. And then the last one here is around Jamf Connect and conditional access all apps policy requiring MFA. We actually heard this quite a bit last year at JNUC. We see this come up from time to time in the Mac admin Slack. So let's talk about what's kind of happening in this scenario real quick. So when we apply a policy to all applications, we're actually applying this to something called the Microsoft Graph API. This is the underlying API for everything in Microsoft 365. So previously when I mentioned how Teams was doing a graph call to get your calendar information from Exchange, that's using the Microsoft Graph. And we see customers apply policies like this because this kind of gives that baseline conditional access policy, right? Anytime a new app gets added, we'll make sure conditional access policy is in scope of that request. This is also how we handle things like PowerShell. PowerShell is one of those desktop applications. We cannot apply a conditional access policy to a mobile or desktop app. But under the covers, PowerShell is just doing a graph call anyways to get it from the Graph API. So this is how we're going to protect that. We're going to apply it to the resource, which is all applications. And then what happens is we exclude more specific users and apps and things like that when we have more specific conditional access policies. This is what we kind of see when you have that all apps policy. But what's the issue that we're actually running into? When you have this kind of policy and you have an application that does, as the Microsoft documentation calls it, ROPC, the Jamf documentation calls it ROPG, this is what Jamf Connect does. This is a tremendous amount of trust needs to be placed in an application that does this protocol authentication flow. Because what's happening is the user is giving their username and password to that application, and the application is then authenticating as that user to the service, okay? So the authentication happens, and then conditional access says, oh, you need to be able to perform an MFA challenge and response, right? So that gets kicked in, and because there's no web UI here, there's no way for that user to satisfy that MFA challenge and response. So we see two things start to happen. The first one is that we start to see errors in the sign-in logs. This is expected because the users are failing those MFA challenges. But this makes it more difficult for our SOC to determine did the username password get compromised, or is there something else going on here? And then the other thing we start to see is that if there's any risk on that user, this also starts to kind of rise. If this would just kind of come out there, okay. The risk on that user starts to increase. So if you have any risk-based conditional access policies that say if the user goes to high risk, we either want to block their access entirely, or we want to do a password reset, you're artificially increasing this risk on this user for no real reason, and then we force them to do a password reset when they really don't have to. So Michael's actually going to talk a lot more about this specific scenario and how we can actually meet all of these challenges and still keep our conditional access policies turned on. But with that, I'm going to turn over to Sean here to talk about the Jamf Pro aspect.
Thank you very much. And
go far.
Go far. Boom. There we go. Before we go, would anybody over here like a seat? If you'd like to, come on over across the stage. But remember, when you get to the center, you have to wave to the camera and say, hi, Mom. Come on down. It's all good. Got to say, hey, Mom, every time, though.
There's some seats over here, yeah.
There's a couple of seats if you wanted to. There you go. Life is good. Keeping it light here at JNUC, ladies and gentlemen. All right, so while some folks are actually taking their seat, I just want to get a show of hands, too. Who has actually deployed the device compliance with Microsoft right now in their environment? Cool. You're going to be making some changes here in the very near future. Good news is that it should be reasonably automated, but there's some major changes to the underlying way that this is going to be operating. Now, we know, and this has been the message we've been pitching, as you saw in the keynote there, Jamf Trusted Access isn't a product, it's a whole idea of a bunch of different pieces that you've been using together. And one of the advantages that we're going to be doing here by using the new compliance structure here, using the Partner Compliance API with Microsoft, is that because Jamf Pro knows everything about that device, we're able to go beyond what you would normally be able to see inside of Microsoft Intune traditionally up to this point. We can actually build smart device groups and smart computer groups that have any level of complexity to go out there and determine if a device is compliant or not. So the first order of business here is we can go for some real basic type of rules like, is the operating system up to date? Do we have the device encrypted, et cetera, et cetera. But we can actually go way more complex. So one of the things that you actually saw in the keynote there, built by Alan and the team here at Jamf, is that macOS, as the part of the macOS compliance project, is the Jamf Compliance Editor. That actually creates smart computer groups that you can use for not only reporting, but you could use that or some subset thereof to determine if a device is actually compliant or not. which means that you can say, okay, is this device NIST compliant? Yes, it meets our conditional access policy at this point. We can go really crazy, and the real trick here is now the Jamf Pro, all it needs to do actually is just tell Microsoft Entra ID that yes, the device is compliant or not. It doesn't have to rely on Entra actually doing calculations, which means any time that a device inventory updates, it updates Entra ID to tell it, yes, this device is compliant or not. You might have seen a whole bunch of graphics in the past here. I made a slight modification to the one you saw in the keynote here. Just pretend that you just see Microsoft every time. So don't panic if it says Intune, if it says Azure, if it says Microsoft Entra ID. Jamf Pro uses Microsoft and says, hey, this device is compliant. Microsoft then turns around and says, is this action happening on a compliant device? If yes, then allow them to have access to the resource. The idea being that if the device is not in compliance, it'll send it to a place where you can use it, you can remediate that problem. The idea probably being Jamf self-service, so you can go do something like run a software update or update your, turn on encryption, et cetera, et cetera. Now, we're about to go through a whole bunch of instructions really, really fast, and I apologize. You'll have to watch this again on repeat when you get to see the videos again afterwards, but if you wanted to, slap a copy of this QR code on your phone right here. This will bring you a linky to the good old Read the Fantastic manual. This is the Jamf Pro instructions, not only for how to set it up inside of Jamf Pro, but it'll also give you a link inside there for what to do to move your devices from classic device compliance to the new conditional access policies. You are going to need a few things at your beck and call. So number one, you're going to need to be an admin in Jamf Pro, got to be on 1043 or higher. Hopefully everyone's on 1050 or something close to it. Cloud hosted, that's important. If you're on-prem, sit tight. More details to come in the near future on that one. You're going to need to have a Azure portal global administrator to set up the application for the first time, because I don't know, are they calling it Microsoft Entra ID Cloud Portal at this point yet? We don't know. Anyway, portal.azure.com. It's all good. Go to that. You're also going to need, if you're going to be deploying out to iOS or iPadOS devices, some VPP licenses for the Authenticator app. We'll get into why a little bit later, as well as the Microsoft Company Portal application, which you can either download from macadmins.software, or you can also just install it automatically using Jamf's app catalog. Before you get started, what you're going to need to do is determine what is going to be able to be registered with a smart device and smart computer group, and you're going to need to figure out what is going to be a compliant device with a smart device and smart computer group. So for a Mac OS device, it's really simple. All we really need, am I looking at Mac OS? Smart device groups. Now, iOS, sorry, my bad. You need to make sure that you have the Microsoft Authenticator application on the device, and you need to make sure that Jamf self-service is on the device. Whoa, what just happened? The question was, does it have to be the Microsoft Authenticator, or can it be any authenticator? It has to be the Microsoft Authenticator, and there's a good reason for that, and I'll get into that in just a second there, because not only is that going to actually register the device and make it so that we see it in Entra ID, but we're going to get into something a little bit fun called the single sign-on extension here in a second. For the Mac OS devices, we have to do the exact same thing. We have to decide what's going to be a compliant group and what's eligible for registration. So for registration, it's real simple. It needs to have the company portal app on there from Microsoft. I left it out. It's not on the slide. Dang it, I made a mistake. Oh, well, it happens. You also have to have the Jamf self-service application on there as well. And there we go. Technology. I know how to use it. There we go. You also, this is the group that you can use to decide if something's going to be compliant as reported to Microsoft Entra ID. But again, like I said, if you want to get complex, if you want it to go bigger than that, don't panic. QR code here will link you over to the Jamf compliance editor. You can create those standards automatically and then use them as compliance if you wish as well. Now, here's why you need to have, on top of the fact that you're using the company portal and Microsoft Authenticator app on here, make this a lot easier on your end users. We're actually going to use the single sign-on extension that's built into macOS and iOS here to simplify the onboarding feature for people. What this means is that once a user logs in with Company Portal, once they get to compliant with on their iOS devices with Authenticator, they will be automatically logged in to any resource that is gated with Microsoft Entra ID from that point forward. A copy of the credentials will be cached. It's not actually the credentials, it's a primary refresh token. We can go down that rabbit hole if you wish. Hi, Sean Rabbit, nice to meet you. But we don't need to get into that right now. Just keep in mind that essentially what's going to happen is your device is not just going to be marked as a registered and compliant device. It now becomes a physical access token of a managed device that you possess, and you happen to have a knowledge factor in order to get into it. Either that's going to be something like Face ID, Touch ID to get into the box to start the session up, or it's going to be I need the passcode or password in order to start up the device for the first time. Thank you, FileVault, for always and forever needing to have a password. Inside of Jamf Pro, it's pretty simple to do the setup here. Once you've got your smart computer groups and smart device groups established, you go into settings. Your number one, if you do have device compliance turned on, you will have RTFM and read that fantastic manual telling you what you do inside Intune first. But you also have to turn off the device compliance before you can turn on this option here for the new, turn off conditional access before you can turn on device compliance. You'll list the two smart device groups. You don't have to turn on both iOS and macOS at the same time. You can turn them on and off later if you wish, and you'll say where you want your remediation page to go. Once you turn that on, you're going to get redirected to the Microsoft site. This is where you need to be global administrator. You're basically giving Jamf Pro permission in order to see what's going on with the device, and you're also giving us permission to be able to say who is the person on that device and report that into Microsoft to say yes, they're actually compliant or not. Lastly, once you're done with Jamf Pro is going to redirect you automatically to the right place in the endpoint management's, Microsoft's endpoint, the former Intune Admin Center. It's not named this anymore, but you will then tell it that Jamf is going to be responsible for determining if the device is compliant or not, and that's about it. Once you're done, it'll report back saying, is Jamf talking to Microsoft, and are we happy? For your iOS devices, it's pretty simple to do the setup. You just simply have to go into Authenticator the first time. But for macOS, you do actually have to run a policy. So you tell your users to go into self-service. We'll set the policy up for you pretty easily, though. There's just a button you press saying this policy enrolls the device. Make sure you scope all your applications onto the computer. So for the Microsoft Company Portal, you can actually do that from the Jamf app catalog. We'll keep it up to date for you, install the latest version. No reason for you to take and deal with that. For iOS devices, it's simply just deploy out the Microsoft Authenticator and assign a VPP app license to the device. Sweet, simple, and easy. Now here's what it'll actually end up looking like for your Mac users. And if you've ever done this in the old way, it's going to be a lot simpler. Simply instruct your users to open the Jamf self-service application and find the app, the policy that is, that enrolls the computer. This will open up the Company Portal application for the user. And if they have never logged into a Microsoft service up to this point, when they hit the sign-in button, they will see the new single sign-on extension for Enterprise, where they will log in. This will get that primary refresh token stored inside the Company Portal application. Don't worry about this ADFS thing here. That's just because I set up my server that way because I was crazy. You should use all Entra ID Cloud everything all the time. Now, what used to happen here at this point is your user would be shown, hey, your device is registered, isn't that great? Now they're going to have to close the app and press a bunch of buttons and hit accept certificate. No, because of the power of the single sign-on extension, it does it silently in the background for you. Life is good. Just a note of something that's come up recently from 1050 support and the single sign-on extension. You have to have your authentication policies and conditional access policies be logical. there is a conflict between saying that somebody needs to re-authenticate every X number of hours or minutes and having the single sign-on extension on a device. So when Jamf AD goes and reports its status and does a check of is this device compliant, reports it to Jamf Pro and updates the inventory, if you have it set up that you have to re-authenticate every 2 hours, you will have a problem. And that means that that person's going to have to do another manual interactive login in order to make sure the device stays compliant. So write your conditional access policies with intelligence. Very smart to go in and look and make sure it's not messed up. Lastly, if that user wants to go in and see the registration status of their device, they can simply open up the company portal application. Come on. There we go. They can open up the Microsoft Company Portal application. They can see their current status. They can see the status of the device to make sure they can actually get into any of their gated applications. But extra bonus, because they now have the single sign-on extension for enterprise, anything that is gated with a login to Microsoft Entra ID now can use those cache credentials and that primary refresh token. So if we wanted to go for our full trusted access solution and start up Jamf Trust to route our information through the proper VPN endpoints, so that way that can be used as part of a conditional access policy to determine if it's safe traffic or not, we can do that automatically. They didn't have to type in any username and password. They started Jamf Trust, and it's tied to that person's user identity. For those folks out there in the world that really, really love seeing everything about their entire Mac fleet in a single pane of glass, don't panic. You can still go into, instead of now going into Intune to see your devices, you simply go into Microsoft Entra ID, go to the Azure portal, and it now shows up in Active Directory as a computer. Remember old school binding? Everybody always wanted to see all their Macs in one place. They want to see an AD? Well, congratulations, it's back in AD again. Here. I turn it over to Mike.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to talk about Jamf Connect and conditional access. So I actually came to this conference last year, and after my session, I was actually approached by a number of customers who were using Jamf Connect who expressed some frustration with the number of problems that they were running into when they were using conditional access in their environment. So we spent some time over the last year going through what those problems were. We worked with Sean and some other folks from Jamf, and we worked internally to make sure that we could come up with a good solution that anybody who uses Jamf Connect can utilize if Entra ID is your IDP of choice. So just to call back to what Mark was talking about earlier, I want to reiterate that Jamf Connect is not a cloud app. It is one of these client applications that we cannot apply conditional access policies to directly. So conditional access is always applied to a resource, and then logically the next question is, how do we do things like apply conditional access to Jamf Connect? Because one of the things that we heard from customers is, I want to require MFA at that lock screen and have it applied successfully. So the way we do this is by calling a resource. So we can apply conditional access to resources, and so we need an API that we can target with our CA policy. So the question becomes, which API? So there's Azure AD Graph API. This is going away, so support for this is being deprecated. If you're doing anything with Azure AD Graph API, please move off of it. Microsoft Graph API is another option. This one's sticking around, so this is the API for everything M365, but it has some limitations that don't make it a great candidate necessarily for Jamf Connect. Namely that if you create one of those all apps policies, you cannot exclude the Microsoft Graph API from that policy. So I'll talk a little bit about what problems this causes for us in a moment. So the best option is going to be a custom API. We're going to register our own. The downside here is that it's a little bit of extra configuration work for the administrator, but I'm going to walk you through it, and we have documentation on how to actually achieve this. So the reason we need a custom API is really because we're doing two separate authentication flows with Jamf Connect, and we are trying to apply different requirements depending on the flow. So there's what the Jamf Connect configuration tool calls the OIDC flow, and then there's also the ROPG or ROPC flow. So the OIDC flow is the one where you see the interactive login screen, and we can do things like challenge for interactive MFA. And then the ROPG flow is the one where Jamf Connect, which is in possession of the username and password, is constantly sending that username and password to Entra ID, asking us to tell Jamf Connect if that credential is still valid. So you may be familiar with what this looks like. On the left, we have a tenant that is not using ADFS because nobody should be using ADFS anymore. So that's the Entra ID login page where we can apply things like interactive controls. And then on the right, we have ROPG, ROPC. You can see that it's not going to go very well if Entra ID challenges for, say, a Microsoft Authenticator push notification. Like Mark mentioned earlier, you're going to end up with failed sign-ins in your sign-in logs. This is going to cause havoc in your environment because, one, it's going to look like your users are under a password spray attack, so it may freak your sock out. Or two, if you're using identity protection, it may actually make the user look like they're at risk, and then other things may happen, like we may trigger a secure password reset for the user when it's not really warranted. So we need to use this custom API method to get around these problems. So there's a few common customer requirements that we hear when we have these conversations about Jamf Connect and conditional access. One is I want to require MFA in that lock screen. Two is that I need those ROPG checks to be successful so that I'm not flooding my sign-in logs with failed sign-ins, even though these are checks that should be succeeding. I got those out of order. But we need the Jamf Connect checks to succeed, and we need the sign-in logs to be clean. So those are two really critical requirements. And then the fourth is basically a generic requirement that we hear from Mac admins all the time that we're trying to help you achieve here, which is that we want Mac users to have roughly a similar security posture as the Windows users in an environment. And if you're signing into Windows Entra ID joined devices, you're not flooding your sign-in logs with errors, so we need to do the same thing on Mac OS. So let's talk about the problems if we were to use something like an all apps policy and Microsoft Graph instead of our custom API. So the first problem is if we created a conditional access policy that applies to all apps and requires MFA, it's going to block those ROPG sign-ins. So now we're getting failures in the sign-in logs over and over and over again. It's going to work fine for that OIDC option, though, as long as the user has a network connection and they're registered for MFA. So this doesn't work. Also, if you're starting to apply those zero trust style conditional access policies, your organization may have CA policies that apply to all apps and are requiring compliant devices. So same as before, this doesn't work for the ROPG flow, but this one also blocks the OIDC flow because the device certificate that's needed to successfully pass a compliant device check is not available at the lock screen because the keychain doesn't unlock until you actually successfully sign into the device. So this is another problem customers run into. Then we have a problem of exclusions. So maybe we do go register our custom API, and we have Jamf Connect sign in against that instead of Microsoft Graph API. So this kind of works. We get successful sign-ins for both flows, but we don't get that MFA requirement for OIDC. So we need that piece as well. So how do we actually do this? We actually need more than one custom app and API, which is why I said that this is going to be a little bit of work for you. But again, I'm going to walk you through it, and if you go to that aka.ms link, that links to the latest Jamf guidance on how to deploy Jamf Connect using this technique. There we go. All right, so the solution is going to involve registering 3 separate applications in Entra ID. So we're going to have one that is for ROPC, and then we're going to have an OIDC one, and then an API one. And you'll see why we need both of those OIDC and API ones in a second. We're going to exempt our ROPC app from any all apps policies. Any conditional access control like MFA, compliant device, anything is going to break that ROPC flow. We need to exempt it from everything. For the other two, we are going to include that API cloud app in a conditional access policy that requires MFA, but we're going to make sure we exempt it from any conditional access device controls. And then the OIDC cloud app, we'll just exempt that from everything as well. So if we do that, ROPG is going to work because there's no controls applied to it. And OIDC is going to work by virtue of setting up that OIDC app so that when someone signs into that using Jamf Connect, that they're going to request a custom scope on the token that is tied to that API app. So remember, Mark said that conditional access applies to resources. So we create a resource so that when we sign into the front-end application, which is the OIDC app, that it calls the API in the background, and then we can scope that API into the CA policies that we need. And this gives us the flexibility to meet those requirements. There's one other wrinkle here that I'm going to talk about in a second, but just to show you what this might look like if you were to go configure it, you can see I have 3 app registrations in the portal, and then on the API app, I basically create a custom API scope. There's no real API, there's no web server running out there. This is just a configuration that we need to do in the Entra ID portal in order to get this all to work. And then on my OIDC app, I say when a user signs into this OIDC app, ask for this resource, and then when conditional access gets evaluated, we look at the policies that apply to that particular resource. There's one other wrinkle here that causes a problem, which is that you cannot select ROPC applications in conditional access policies. But I did say that we need to exempt that ROPC app from all the CA policies. So we actually came up with a technique for doing that that we're going to officially support. And that is going to be using something called app tagging in Entra ID. This is a fairly new concept. It's still in public preview. We're marching towards GA hopefully pretty soon. But basically what you can do is you can create a custom attribute, and then you can tag applications with it, and in your conditional access policies, exclude apps with that particular tag, and we'll dynamically assess whether or not an application has that tag at the time the user is authenticating. So we have guidance on this as well. You can get fairly complex with this concept, so definitely go read the documentation, but for our purposes here for Jamf Connect, it's not too bad. So basically what you're going to do is you're going to go into those CA policies where you need to exempt the ROPC application or any other app you tag with this attribute. You're going to go to the Cloud Apps section. So you can see I'm including all cloud apps. And now I'm going to go to the exclude and add a dynamic filter and just say exempt any application that has this filter applied to it. And so this is going to allow you to get that ROPG, ROPC, Jamf Connect application completely exempted from sign-ins. So we're using this tag because, again, normally ROPG apps will not show up in the picker. There's good reasons why we do that, but in this case, it does make sense to give you an option. So that's why we're presenting this. So you cannot explicitly include or exclude ROPG apps, but you can dynamically target them using this method. However, I want to emphasize that you should use caution using this technique for other scenarios. Some customers take the logical leap to say, oh, I could do this for Microsoft Graph API because I want to include or exclude it from other CA policies. Do not do this. We don't test it, we don't support it. Microsoft Graph API and other Microsoft APIs really should not be used in that way. So please make sure that you stick to using this for Jamf Connect or other scenarios where it makes sense. Don't go break your M365 tenant. All right, so to wrap up, we have a couple go-dos. So one is understand those CA policies in your environment. Make sure your Apple users are in scope. I said earlier we want the same experience for our Windows users and Apple users. There is no reason to be exempting your Apple users from conditional access policies if you follow our guidance. We want to make sure that they're protected just like everybody else is. So make sure that you are doing device compliance for all your devices. If you're using conditional access to enforce device controls, get those Apple devices integrated. Move to that new Jamf Pro device compliance option. As you saw in Sean's demo, it is much better on the end user. It has many more capabilities on the Jamf side, so we think that this is a win-win for everybody. Deploy the enterprise SSO extension everywhere. We're starting to see iOS actually lag behind a little bit. Everybody did a good job after my talk last year deploying it for your Macs. Don't forget your iOS devices. This should be deployed everywhere. Let's give a good user experience to users regardless of device. Move to the new Jamf Connect setup option. It's a little bit harder than what you had to set up in the past, but it's much better from a security and visibility perspective in your tenant. And then hit us up on Slack or social media. Feel free to reach out. We're always happy to hear from customers, and we're willing to help out if you run into any issues or have any questions. And there's one other elephant in the room I want to discuss, which is platform SSO. So we're not really ready to do a deep dive session on how this works and what how we're building it and configuring it, but we couldn't really pass up the opportunity to promote the fact that we are actually working on this. So we are in private preview currently. We did announce at that QR code, there's a blog post that we are going to public preview in the near future. When we go to public preview, Intune will be supported right away. But we are working hard to partner with Jamf to make sure that we can add Jamf and other third-party MDMs so that we can support everybody in this room. So if you're interested in platform SSO, make sure your users are registered for some MFA method, preferably, and also, obviously, make sure you are on a device OS that's going to support it. And with that, thank you for listening.
Now, I do know that we are the only thing keeping you from lunch, so this is a heads up. Adam here has got some questions that you all have been asking us during the session. And if you do have more questions, we do have those brain dates, so you can date our brains later, as well as we will be down at lunch for the entire time. So feel free to come grab us and find us.
The two biggest questions. Number one, are your slides going to be made available for anybody attending this session?
A recording of this session will be available shortly after JNUC, and the slides, I don't think there's any problem with me slapping it up on my GitHub. Do you guys think so?
Yeah, I was going to put them up there too.
Sweet.
Cool.
We'll have them on GitHubs in multiple places. Sean-Rabbit is my GitHub, so you can find it there at least.
Awesome. The one that had the most votes, this comes from Rich Trouton. Uh-oh. One of the user experience issues with Entra ID enrollment is that it requires user interaction in the GUI with Microsoft's company portal app. Can this be handled entirely via command line tools? For context, we want to work with Entra ID device enrollment into our new machine setup process, but have minimal or no user interaction.
I'll take that one for you there. So one of the things that we showed was using the enrollment, not the enrollment single sign-on, but the standard single sign-on for enterprise. And we need to be able to get that primary refresh token into the application, which does require a one-time interactive login with the user following whatever your conditional access policy is currently. Once that primary refresh token is in the company portal application, they should never have to interact again. However, we do need to have a user session established first. We need to be able to make sure we can write to that keychain to both get the certificate down for the marking as conditional access compliant, as well as getting the PRT in there. So there's going to be at least one user interactive login.
Enrollment SSO will make it smoother for the new device scenario, because we'll be able to do SSO extension setup during enrollment SSO.
And on macOS, ... ask Apple.
Yep.
Cool. So I think there's a couple questions in here, but the moral of the story is there's going to be at least one or two taps or logins that need to happen.
We'll try our damnedest for you to get that down.
Cool. Another one from Rich that has a lot of votes. One of the issues we're seeing is that you can delete the Jamf computer entries in Jamf Pro, but not the Entra ID device compliance entries in Entra ID. It would be good if deleting from Jamf Pro would also clear from Entra ID. Can this be implemented?
We have an API for deleting devices, so this may be a question for you to take back to engineering.
I like how that question was a feature request, though.
Yeah, that's a good feature request question there. We will get back to you on that one. It's a definite maybe. Yeah.
This one comes from Robert Hammond. Is there an ETA for OpenID Connect integration between Apple Business or Tool Manager and Entra ID hosted in GCC High? The current Apple Azure AD integration does not work in a FedRAMP High environment.
I do not know the answer to that, but if you reach out to me, I would be happy to try to track something down.
And Apple support for custom identity providers with Apple Business Manager and Apple School Manager is coming soon. I would refer you to your Apple system engineer who would best answer that question. It's a cabal of questions right here in the center. I love it. I love it.
Another question from the center. We've discovered that having Apple's Kerberos SSO extension deployed as a user-level profile blocks the Microsoft SSOE extension from working. I apologize for the mic issues. There doesn't seem to be a good reason why this would fail, and the documentation available from Microsoft is vague on if the Microsoft SSOE profile should be deployed as a device or user level. Can these functionality and documentation issues be fixed?
I'll take this one for you. Pretend the user level does not exist anymore. It is nigh on unobtainium to get a user level configuration profile on a macOS device unless you are one of two scenarios. Number one, you are the very first computer account that's created with Setup Assistant, with full admin rights, going through automated device enrollment. Two, you are a computer account that was created because you bound your Mac to AD. I don't mean to swear in front of all you like that. Then you should still set it up as a device level no matter what to be on the safe side. Yeah.
We can also update the docs.
And we can update the docs to get that fixed for you.
Stephen Sweeney wants to know if you could skip having the user to launch self-service on iOS to register. Also, is there a way to skip the requirement of a cloud device administrator from having to open Authenticator and register the device?
It's a shared device.
The cloud device administrator requirement was a shared device mode requirement, which I believe we have now removed, if I remember the docs correctly.
As for requiring to open through self-service, so we're actually opening the company portal with a special enrollment URL attached to the open command, which is what that policy that we're creating in Jamf Pro is used to create. So do you need to open self-service? Yes. Can you replicate it? Sort of. Do you want to? No. Can you automate the opening of that particular policy? Absolutely. There is a full URL schema for opening self-service and going to a specific policy. Simply go look for the policy, go to the self-service tab, scroll to the bottom. You can find that open URL. You can use that in any script that you desire. Definitely on macOS for that. Yeah. You can force a user into any policy that you want to by using that URL schema. They'll still have to click something, yeah, but you can force action, open, and run the policy with the URL schema.
Cool. There's an upper limit of 50 enrollments for Entra ID device compliance for a particular device. Is it possible to implement the Jamf Pro-like behavior of reusing the same computer inventory object while blanking out most information for new enrollments? The reason I'm asking that is it's surprisingly easy to hit that 50 device enrollments when testing device compliance workflows. Makes sense.
Seems like a valid ask. I don't know if that's something that we have plans for or not, though.
I mean, you can make it unlimited, right, like the device enrollment, but I don't think you want that either. So yeah, we'll have to take that back. If you want to message us on the Mac admin Slack on the side, that's fine. We can take it back.
Yep.
Cool. Is Jamf Protect needed to use the device compliance that was showcased today?
No. Jamf Protect is not required to use the device compliance you saw today. The device compliance that you saw today involved registering the computer with Jamf Pro. It involved using a smart computer group that was designed either by you by hand or by using the Jamf security compliance editor, which then can upload to Jamf Pro. But if you'd like to get a full idea of what is going on your device at any time, or more importantly, if a security event happens on your device and you want to immediately mark it as non-compliant, you can do that with Jamf Protect. It will drop it into that smart computer group, which will recalculate its inventory immediately. The other thing that you want to look at on top of that, though, the reason why Jamf Trusted Access is basically what we call the business plan these days, is just because the device is not compliant does not mean that the device does not already have an active token to access a service. which is why we use Jamf Trust to say if a device becomes non-compliant, to be able to gank the network layer. So even though that has a device with an active token that's valid, we're actually blocking access to the service at that point. Then, once the device becomes compliant again, they can get new tokens, or more importantly, we can also simultaneously report to Microsoft Entra ID the device is not compliant, did not give it any new tokens until the problem is resolved. That's why it all comes together in the end. Buy the whole thing. Awesome. Thus ends the sales pitch.
How can we troubleshoot different failures to access resources and determine if device registration or compliance is at fault or if something else is going on?
So Mark showed the workbooks. In his section, we actually have a conditional access workbook as well that I'd probably recommend starting with. It'll show things like users getting blocked because they failed to pass device-based conditional access policies that are requiring compliance, or failed MFAs, those sorts of things. So that's probably the place to start.
Also in the sign-in logs, if you have a failure, you can do it will show you which part of the policy like it didn't apply to as well. So that's a good place to start.
For accessing on-prem domain resources, will Authenticator trade the PRT for an NTLM token or TGT? Or do we still need the Kerberos sys extension for domain resources?
They are two completely different sets of resources, and you can deploy the Kerberos single sign-on extension as well as the SSOE for cloud-based resources at the same time, or you can also use Jamf Connect to grab those Kerberos tickets for you if you wish.
Seems like another one came in regarding making the registration process more seamlessly. How can conditional access registration be most effectively and seamlessly worked into device enrollment and setup? Any recommendations?
The trick is you have to go through full device enrollment, and you have to go and get to the point where Finder exists on the machine, and you have to make sure that the company portal application is installed on the box first. So once that happens, then if part of that installation of the policy for company portal, maybe it runs a script, maybe it runs an open a Jamf self-service action for a policy, that could be automated in many different ways. There's also great onboarding tools with things like Swift Dialog and lots of different onboarding scripts. My partner in crime last year for JNUC there also did a recent release of a new Swift onboarding tool there. So check out Franton's pile of stuff there on Mac admins, and lots of tools.
Awesome, thanks, Sean. Question from Jose, can you have Jamf MDM profiles on a Mac and still use the Intune add-on to Entra ID?
Yes, if you're referring to the SSO extension, it is MDM agnostic. As long as your MDM can push out the proper configuration profile, company portal just needs to be there to provide the SSO capabilities. So it doesn't have to be Jamf, it doesn't have to be Intune, it can be any MDM can push an SSO extension profile to get that better user experience.
This seems like a lot of extra work just to get Jamf Connect working.
It seems like a lot of extra work to get Jamf Connect working, but it's not really. We can actually narrow this down by saying, when your normal instructions for Jamf Connect is create one app registration inside of Microsoft. You simply just do that process 3 times, but that's okay because then you just take and drop and copy paste different app IDs into the Jamf Connect configuration application, which comes for free as part of the installer package for Jamf Connect. Press the button to make sure that you get MFA when you're expected to. Press the button to make sure you don't get MFA when you expected not to show up, and deploy it out. It's maybe an extra 30 minutes worth of work at most. It's not bad. Don't panic. The only reason why the instructions look terrible is because I'm the one that wrote them.
Sean, what is your best practice recommended workflow for handling password resets? So if a user forgets a password without anybody from IT having to touch the device.
Remember that the entire purpose of Jamf Connect, and even eventually when it comes out for the platform single sign-on, is to create a local Mac OS Unix user account on a local individual little island of identity known as that MacBook. If you forget that password, your best process is to use the Apple mandated, here's how do you reset your password, which you skip down to step 3, and that basically says, go into Jamf, get the file vault recovery key, use that to reset the local password. That is always going to be your best option, because of course, you're all turning on file vault, aren't you? Good choice.
Finally, if somebody has questions regarding on-prem tenants, how can they reach out? I'm assuming this question was regarding on-prem Jamf Pro tenants.
If you have questions about on-premises Jamf Pro tenants, or you're in GovCloud right now for Jamf Pro, reach out to your account representative and we'll give you details of future information, forward-looking statements, blah, 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 timeframes, don't ask me, not it, and we will get you information as soon as we have it for you.
That concludes all the questions that were submitted via the app. I got one right here. I'll get it so everybody could hear online.
No worries.
It's all good.
And thank you all for coming if you are going to lunch. So.
Hey, just had a quick question with the SSO extension
Yes.
that you pushed through, on specifically Mac OS. Is this supposed to work with the Office applications, like Teams, Outlook?
Yeah.
Yes.
And is it a known error that it doesn't work? Because
bet you
honestly,
it's a
I've been working on this for almost a year with Microsoft Premier support, and we cannot get this thing to work.
Does your implementation work with Safari?
Yeah. Works with all the websites, everything, not an application like Outlook. The users have to type in their email and password for the first time they connect all their things.
Good question. Let's take that question
Yeah, let's follow up
offline
and see if we can figure out
follow
what's
up on
going on.
that
It should
one.
work.
Yeah, it should work.
Cool.
Beautiful.